My paper is called The Mountain Meadows Massacre as told by Mark Twain and Jack London. The events of September 11, 1857, known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, is infamous. That Mormon militiamen and the Paiute Indians they drafted carried out the slaughter of 120 members of the Fancher party of wagons headed to California is no longer disputed, nor is their kidnapping of 17 small children. Did the Mormon militia leader John D. Lee and state president Isaac Haight in the Cedar City area act on their own, or were there orders from the highest church authority, Brigham Young himself? However history portrays that deadly day, unlike the vast majority of Americans at the time, the two leading fiction writers of the day, Mark Twain and Jack London, offered in their literary works thoughtful and nuanced accounts not only of the massacred settlers, but also, surprisingly for their time, of their assailants and of Mormonism in general. Here I offer a short history of the event and especially its historical context. The difference between how Twain portrays the Mormons in chapters 12 through 16 of Roughing It in a jocular and satirical fashion. But then he includes Appendix A in the book, which defends them as an oppressed, persecuted people. And finally, London in chapters 12 through 13 of the STAR ROVER, a novel that came out in 1915, presents the victims of the massacre and the situation of the Mormons in America from both sides. They both got their facts right, as historical research goes. I've consulted numerous sources and will continue to, but the standard and most reliable source is by Juanita Brooks, called The Mountain Meadows Massacre, first published in 1950 and since reprinted many times. Brooks, a Mormon, not only tells in all its details the horrors of the massacre and condemns it, but she also provides a historical context. As she explains, nearly since their founding, the Mormons have been beaten, robbed, lynched, their homes burned, their churches burned, driven west from New York State to state after state until they headed to Utah. They were persecuted in every town by Christians who hated them, partly on religious grounds, but I think more so because they were very prosperous and growing quickly in membership. Here's a quote from Brooks. The people of southern Utah, most of whom had lived through the persecutions in Missouri and Nauvoo, recalled burnt-out homes and the many deaths, burnt-out homes and the many deaths and their whiplashed backs. Their scripture enjoined them to protect their homes and families. Quote, so the wind grew into the whirlwind, exaggeration, misrepresentation, ungrounded fears, unreasoning hate, desire for revenge, and yes, even lust for the property of the immigrants, all combined to give justification, which once the crime was overlooked, was inadequate and flimsy indeed, and that was Brooks. A letter from Brigham Young to his nephew John Young on September 4th, 1857, so a few days before the massacre, stated clearly their fears of genocide. Quote, we had determined years ago, if a mob again attack us, we will resist their aggression. End quote. He expressed the survival of the Mormons as a matter of, quote, getting away from Christians. It seems that the massacre had been planned for some time because the Mormons had heard that wagons of immigrants from Missouri, where they had been especially persecuted, were on their way, and they started drilling for a fight. The Fancher party was actually from Arkansas, but they thought otherwise. As in most tragedies, there were endless misunderstandings that mounted one upon the other. Mormons believed they had a separate kingdom to protect, not of this world. They were constantly asked to sell grain and other supplies to immigrants. And during this time, their grain stores were at an all-time low. They didn't have enough grain to sell. They also thought mistakenly that the settlers had poisoned their wells. Haight gave a speech on September 6 containing sentiments shared by his listeners, and that is quotation number 1, where he talks about when we asked for bread, they gave us stones. When we asked for help, they they drove us out. As Brooks adds, this was the last source of supplies before the desert to California, and the settlers met only hostility. After trying to pay or barter, some of the men of the Arkansas Party, quote, felt free to help themselves. Worse still, they were loud in their abuse of the Mormons in general and the leaders in particular. They boasted of what they would do when the army came to set these people straight. Haight and the others in command held a meeting and voted for vengeance. Mormons blamed the massacre on the Indians, and it's true that the Indians committed especially brutal murders, such as hacking women to death after torturing them and smashing infants' heads with rocks. But so did the Saints. They had tricked the Fancher party out of their weapons with promises to protect them from the Indians and conduct them along their way. Then they methodically shot them as they walked in single file, as ordered, minus their cattle, wagons, arms, and everything else. Twain and his party visited Salt Lake City and other Mormon settlements. His accounts satirized polygamy, the Mormon Bible, Mormon women, and so on. But in chapter 17, he mentions the Mountain Meadows Massacre, how Mormons and Gentiles he met gave very differing accounts of events, and that's quotation number 2. Twain's comment is about how the journalist played out this story is strongly supported by what seems to have been sensationalistic coverage of the events, with condemnation of Mormons as a whole, especially the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, whose readers could not hear enough about it. In addition, Kate Field published a scathing argument about Mormon, quote, blood atonement, arguing that it is real, and by that she's describing an idea that taking another person's life atones that person's sins and is not a sin for the Mormon who is justified in killing the wicked. Finally, in 1863, the British Medical Journal, just as an example of how the Mormons were looked at, refers to the Mormon people as obsequious and yielding to their superiors, while among themselves they are cold and unamiable. The journal goes on to say, other physical characteristics used to name the perceived makeup of the Mormon people, all are stamped with a mingled air of imbecility and brutal ferocity. They hold a bold and defiant look of habitual and hardened sensuality. They have a certain feebleness and emaciation of person, cheeks sallow and cadaverous, indicating an absence of good health, a general lack of color, with an eye that is dull and lusterless. In the life of Mark Twain, the first volume, Gary Scharnhorst notes that Twain disapproved of the Mormons but had really no interest in their debates. He probably shared Orion's opinion that Mormons were, quote, about as tractable and peaceable as so many grizzly bears. Scharnhorst continues, and that would be quotation number 3. He talks about Sam joking about the Mormons, and he gives that wonderful line that we just heard about a man who marries 60 of them and so on. Of polygamy, as we've heard, he did not approve. And he said that, quote, some portly old frog of an elder or bishop marries a girl, likes her, marries her sister, likes her, marries another sister, likes her, takes another, likes her, marries her mother, likes her, marries her father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and then comes back hungry and asks for more. Twain also found, as we've heard, the Book of Mormon to be a prosy detail of imaginary history, which he says was smouthed from the Old Testament. But Twain could not leave it just with the satire. He added the two appendices, A and B, to further discuss Mormonism. Appendix A, called A Brief Sketch of Mormon History, and Appendix B, The Mountain Meadows Massacre. These are curiously mixed in their analysis. Appendix A is an eloquent defense of the Mormons, whom Twain saw as a persecuted people driven over the edge of reason by threats from the federal government and locals everywhere. In Appendix A, he gives a very well-researched explanation of how the Mormons, quote, have been hunted and hounded from one end of the country to the other, and the result is that for years they have hated all Gentiles indiscriminately and with all their might. He continues that after they were driven from New York, and this is quotation number 4, the details, just the constant harassment and murder of Mormons as they were driven west. And at the end of that quote, you notice that Brigham Young had chosen a place where there would not be any federal government. However, disaster struck quickly, and when the Mexican War ended, Utah was ceded to the United States. In 1849, the Mormons organized a free and independent government and erected the state of Deseret, and that would be quotation number 5. The very next year, Congress deliberately destroyed it and created the territory of Utah. And then for years, the Mormons had to deal with settlers crossing their territory and believing that they were in America and not in the kingdom of Deseret. Despite all this, Twain says, quote, hatred has fed its fat and ancient grudge ever since Mormon Utah developed into a self-supporting realm and the church waxed rich and strong. In Appendix B, he relates the events of the massacre and is not particularly understanding of the Mormon situation as he was in Appendix A. Although he does point out that the prosecution of most of the participants in the massacre was dropped in favor of blaming it on the Indians. Why would Twain privately state that he disapproved of the Mormons, satirize them savagely, and then defend them so passionately? Perhaps he shared a similar desire to flee Christians, and he was appalled by the conditions in the Great Basin. He found most of the Mormons he encountered to be decent people, if sometimes he thought tiresome. But in my opinion, it's mostly his constant defense of the oppressed, once again, as shown throughout his career. In addition, he now knew what they had been through to cross into Utah. He had to do it too. Turning to London's The Star Rover, sometimes marketed as the reincarnation novel, it's still quite popular, especially in the West. See especially zip codes for Sedona, Santa Cruz, and Marin, is both an example of early 20th century science fiction and a politically charged call for prison reform, a strange hodgepodge of storylines and consisting of a character, Ed Morrell, who was a real person, a train robber and murderer, was put in San Quentin in a straitjacket and believed that he could astral project into past lives. And so the book is made up of these assorted past lives. It was successful in advancing prison reform, and London did meet and interview the real-life protagonist, Ed Morrell, and heard his, quote, real tales about his astral projection. London himself disavowed any such thing, but he liked the story. Morrell had become a sort of underground hero in California for robbing the Southern Pacific Railroad, which everyone hated. His notoriety in anti-capitalist history inspired London to go to the file cabinet and pull out, in his next to last year, a number of unrelated, unpublished stories and spin them into the hero's various lives. In the novel, the character Darrell Standing is tortured in prison and learns to save himself. He becomes a lord in medieval Korea, a French count of the 17th century, the shipwrecked sailor Daniel Foss, a desert ascetic, a Roman soldier present at the crucifixion, and also Jesse Fancher, the 9-year-old son of the real-life leader of the Fancher Party, Captain Alexander Fancher. Chapters 12 and 13 of London's novel are told from Jesse's first-person point of view. Like Twain, London's narrative blames the Mormons for the attack, though Standing in his own body says he never read anything about it. Jesse tells the events in first person as they happen with only the knowledge that he possesses. But behind the scenes, London had the facts right. The unusually vigorous growth of the church allowed people to blame the Mormons for just about everything. However, in the STAR ROVER, the author's overall intent again seems mixed. The little boy keeps talking about Mormons ain't white. I hate Mormons. Mormons are evil. And every time he does it, his mother slaps him and says, I won't tolerate this kind of prejudice in my son. And so in the book, you know, he tells about the massacre, but it's more important that when he says things like, I'll shoot you full of lead, you damn Mormon, he keeps getting slapped by his mother. So there's clearly a sort of sense, at least in the mother, of prejudice against Mormons being wrong. To wrap up, she tells Jesse, their quarrel is with the government, not with us. We'll be fine. But Jesse continues to talk about scalping Mormons and all kinds of things. Thus, London sides with the Fancher Party, but goes to some length to put the situation in a broader view through the mother. Why did London sympathize with the Mormons? He was a self-professed atheist all of his life, though his fiction is full of endless biblical allusions. I would think his experience as hoboing beginning as a young teen, driven to the road by the desperation of poverty, particular dislike of Christianity, and even his historical and anthropological sense of evolutionary wanderings of peoples, as he details in his essay, The Human Drift. As an author often accused of racism, it is striking how he portrays Mrs. Fancher's opposition to prejudice. So to conclude, Jesse and his parents are murdered at Mountain Meadows, along with nearly everyone else, but his story lives on, though in more versions than one, certainly in two very interestingly imagined books by two of America's greatest writers. Interestingly, it took two non-believers, supposed non-believers, in God to see the tragedy on each side. I'm intrigued by the complicated narratives of this massacre and anticipate a lot more research and work on this topic. Thank you so much.